Hey gang, welcome back to another video. So recently I shared my design process for building our haunt's final tombstone. So in this video, I'll show you how I built it, plus some modifications I made along the way. So let's get into it. When we last left off, I had finalized the design for my tombstone, and after looking at the materials I had on hand and the amount of time I had before Halloween, I decided that I was going to tackle this build using a few different methods. Now typically I just use my rotary tool to carve the epitaph into the foam, but instead I decided that I wanted to make a fake metal plaque that would adorn my tombstone. So I imported the design from Illustrator and got down to it. I'll be making the plaque from two stacked pieces of 1/8 inch MDF. The first will have the design scored into the surface and will act as my template, and a second piece will be cut out that I can apply to the first with a bit of CA glue. I cut the second piece off camera, and now that I have all of my pieces, I can get to assembly. I find that using these small needle tip squeeze bottles and working from right to left makes for a less messy application. Although I have to admit, I did manage to glue my fingers together a few times in the process. But that's the sacrifice we make to the crafting gods. When I've got my epitaph in place, it's time to seal up the fibers of the MDF with a bit of clear coat. You could also use Mod Podge or PVA glue for this, but whatever you use, you'll want to give it a few coats on the front, back, and sides to prevent it from swelling due to exposure to moisture. While I wait for the plaque to dry, let's get started on the tombstone. I printed out my tombstone design at full size using the tile print function in Acrobat, and then I can reassemble the pages to make my template. Once I have everything taped up, I can cut out the shape and get to tracing the design onto my foam. Like most of my tombstones, I'm using 2-inch XPS insulation foam, although you can make tombstones from the white beaded EPS foam. I just prefer this because it's easier to carve, sand, and clean up. I'll trace my design onto the foam, and then I can cut it out using a small pull saw. Now even though the pull saw does a good job, it still leaves a rough edge that needs to be addressed. So I'll grab my palm sander with some 60 grit sandpaper and get to smoothing it out. While a palm sander can do most of the work, there's still some areas that need a little extra help. So I used some sandpaper taped to a dowel to help smooth out the curves, and then I switched over to some 120 grit sandpaper to catch any areas that might be a little rough to get it prepped for paint. Because the plaque will be glued directly to the foam, I'll want to avoid that area to ensure a good bond. So I'll make myself a rough outline of its position, and then I can move on to the upper inset. I'll use my paper pattern once again to trace on the circle inset for the oak leaf design, and then I can grab my rotary tool with a Dremel 115 carving bit and my tombstone carving attachment and get to removing the foam. The 115 bit is larger than my usual carving bit, which is perfect for removing large amounts of foam and oversized lettering. And of course my carving attachment gives me a nice wide platform to ensure even carving, and keeps the rotary tool from running out of flat surfaces to rest on. With that main shape out of the way, I decided to switch gears and do a bit of painting on the plaque, starting with a base coat of dark brown. I followed up the base coat with a dusting of this hammered copper spray paint. This will give me both a metallic and flat finish, which will be the base for a verdigris patina, which should help this plaque stand out a bit more from the finish on the tombstone. And speaking of patina, I'm not using my standard approach for it on this plaque, but rather I'll be thinning my acrylic paint with a bit of glaze, which will help to give it more of a translucent appearance, and should allow for that copper finish to still show through a bit. I'll start out with a brush to apply the paint across the surface, and then I'll switch to a damp sea sponge to help move it around to get rid of any brush strokes. The glaze not only helps with the appearance, but also keeps the paint active a bit longer than if I just used paint on its own. For this application, I mixed about 2 parts glaze to 1 part paint, and that's giving me the best coverage without it being too heavy-handed. I'll continue to work the paint across the surface until it looks the way I want, and then I can do some additional touch-ups. In this case, I really want the Van Oaks name on top to stand out, so I'll go back with just paint and no glaze, and we'll stipple it across the surface. That way I'm getting the full potency of the paint, and will minimize any brush strokes. When I've got good coverage, I can set it aside to dry and move on to the base of my tombstone. After looking at the tombstone, I decided that the scale wasn't quite right. So I grabbed some offcuts of foam and started to assemble a chunkier base that should help to balance it out. But because I'm down to scraps, I'm going to have to piece it together. So I started with a small piece of foam that will act as a shelf for my tombstone, and I'll glue it in place with a bit of white Gorilla Glue and some skewers to help keep it in position while the glue cures. While that's happening, I have some other pieces that will make up the outer edges of the base, and those will get a quick mist of water from my tiny spray bottle, and then I'll apply the glue and set them in place. The water helps the glue set up more quickly and helps make for a stronger bond between pieces of foam, since the Gorilla Glue foams up as it cures, which makes it perfect for projects like this. Once I have all my pieces in place, I'll throw some clamps on it and set it aside to cure. Off camera, I trimmed up the top edge and gave it a quick sanding to smooth it out, and can move on to adding some details with my palm router and a decorative bit. This bit will add a soft round over to the flat top edge and will also make a total mess, but I think it's worth it. I'll follow up with a smaller roundover bit to add the same detail along the foot, and then I can take some 120 grit sandpaper and smooth out any areas where the bit may not have left as clean an impression, as well as smooth out any seam lines in the foam. Now that I've got that taken care of, I can glue the upper and lower parts together. I'm applying glue to the shelf piece plus the insides of the longer face pieces of foam to really help secure the top of the tombstone in position. With all of the build out of the way, I can get to adding a bit of age to the tombstone. I don't want to go too heavy since the dates are only 14 years apart, but I still want some character. So I'll grab a fresh X-Acto knife and we'll add in some small cracks. I like to do this in 2 passes, one for the general shape and direction, and then a follow-up just next to it so that I can pick away at the space between the two with the tip of the blade. I'll add a few cracks to the face of the tombstone, along with some chipping to give it a bit more variety. The last thing I'm going to do before paint is to hide all of my seam lines with a bit of paintable caulk. I'll hit all of the main gaps in construction, as well as any holes left behind from skewers or saws, and once it's dry, I can move on to paint. For all of my tombstones, for as long as I've been making them, I've used Drylock Original Masonry Sealer tinted to a medium gray color. This will get brushed on to ensure good coverage, and then I'll take a second pass at it and we'll pounce the brush across the painted surface to hide any brush strokes and accentuate the stone look. All of this is to help disguise the fact that this is foam and not an actual tombstone, and so I like to take every opportunity to build in textures to the surfaces when I can. I'll give the tombstone 2 coats of paint to ensure good coverage and texture, and then I can set it to dry for a few hours. Once the paint was dry, I glued the plaque onto the foam with Gorilla Glue and made sure to keep the glue at least a ½ inch away from the edge of the plaque to prevent any squeeze out. Then I stacked as many heavy items on it as I could find to make sure there was even pressure while the glue set up. As soon as the glue had dried, I took my tombstone out back and can get to weathering. And for that I'll need 2 spray bottles full of water, as well as some brown, black, and green acrylic paint. I'll start by spraying down the tombstone with water and then immediately follow it with the paint wash, trying to get good overall coverage before going to more targeted application. I've added equal parts brown and green to 1 spray bottle and just a touch of black to prevent it from being too dark. It's probably a 10:1 ratio of paint to water, but this is more about coverage than getting an exact mix by the numbers. I tend to err more on the dark side and will use the second spray bottle of water to help move the paint around. This will get repeated on both the front and back until I'm happy with how it looks, and then I can set it aside to dry. At this point, the only thing left to do is add a few highlights to the plaque, which has since been dulled down from the paint wash. So I'll grab some antique gold rub and buff, and we'll just hit a few high spots to add in a bit of brightness, and then I'm calling this one done.
Now, of course, building this tombstone is bittersweet, but there's a whole bunch of new tombstones I'll need to make for our haunt in the future. So it's not so much as goodbye, but see you soon. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.